Welcome to the Anthro to UX podcast, where you will learn how to break into UX with an anthropology degree. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in user experience, you will learn firsthand how others made the transition, what they learned along the way, and what they would do differently. We will be discussing what it means to do UX research from a practical perspective and what you need to do to prepare a resume and portfolio. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Anthro to UX podcast. I'm Matt Artz. I'm here today with Sara Hefny, who is a senior product researcher at Hotjar. So, Sara, thanks for coming on today. Really looking forward to chatting with you. Would you mind by telling everybody how you came into anthropology?
Yeah. Hi, Matt. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me on. I ended up in anthropology very serendipitously. I originally did my undergraduate degree in Middle Eastern studies, or what the university, their variation of what Middle Eastern studies was. And I had originally intended on going to law school. So out of college, I got a job working as a kind of an assistant to a lawyer in a private boutique law firm in Washington, D.C. And the kind of original game plan was to study for the LSAT, apply to law school, et cetera. And working in a law firm, I quickly realized that I did not want to, in fact, become a lawyer. And I honestly didn't have a backup plan. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I ended up going into anthropology because I decided to go back to school. And at the time, this was in 2012. So, as I told you, my background is in Middle Eastern studies, and the context at the time was that the Arab Spring, as it was called then, was kind of in full swing. There were revolutions happening across the region. The conflict in Syria was really escalating, and so that was kind of dominating the news of the region. And I was really interested and wanted to figure out a way how I could study it. And my mentor from undergrad, who has since passed on, Walter Andrews, asked me if I'd ever considered anthropology. And I was very honest when I said no. I had taken one anthropology class when I was in undergrad, and I remember really enjoying it, but it really never occurred to me that it would be something that I could be interested in. So I started looking into anthropology graduate school programs and quickly realized that if I didn't want to take on massive amounts of student loans, I had to get into a funded PhD program, because all of the MA programs, you basically had to pay, and I did not want to take on any student debt. So basically narrowed down all of the programs that I was interested in. My partner at the time was applying to medical school, and so we were kind of syncing up potential location schools that would work for us. And I applied with this sort of vague idea of wanting to study the Middle East and sociocultural anthropology, and ended up going to Brown. And I wouldn't say I recommend getting a PhD because you aren't sure what else to do. But that's kind of how I fell into it. And there was definitely a learning curve at the beginning. A lot of the folks in my cohort at the time had done undergraduate or master's degrees in anthropology, so they were much more familiar with the pedagogy, the kind of, the main characters, so to speak, in the anthropology world. And it was all new to me. So the first couple of years were definitely a learning curve. And I hadn't thought past the PhD. I didn't really consider academia as a viable option because, again, the context for academia was at the time, and is now, if not even worse, just kind of very precarious, and the chances of getting a job were slim to none. So I had never really considered that as a serious option, but it was kind of one of those, like, I'll cross the bridge when I come to it kind of scenarios. But that was how I initially got into anthropology as a discipline.
So at Brown, was UX discussed?
No, not at all. Any kind of anthropology, anything outside of the academy was not really discussed at all.
So then how did you stumble across the concept?
The same way I stumbled across anthropology very serendipitously. I had finished my years of field work, and I was writing up my dissertation. At the time, I had moved back to Seattle, which is where I am from. My partner had started work in Seattle, and so we moved back to Seattle. And a woman who had graduated from Brown in anthropology a couple of years ahead of me knew that I was moving, and she wrote to me. She was working at Microsoft at the time in UX research, and said, "Hey, I know a team that's looking for a UX researcher. Would you be interested?" And it was honestly not something I had really considered. It's not something I had heard of before. So I wrote back to her and I said, I'm happy to think about it, but I don't have any experience. I wouldn't really know what I'd be getting myself into. And she reassured me that it would be fine. She found herself in a similar scenario when she started working, no previous experience. So I had sent over my resume, which was completely, I don't even know how it made it past the screener, because it was not in any way a kind of tech oriented resume, very academic. And I got very lucky in that the team I ended up being hired to join was a team full of researchers, three of whom had PhDs in various social sciences. And so they created a very soft landing space for me for my first UX role. But like I said, really didn't have a plan. And it was very kind of a stroke of luck and good timing that I found myself in my first role.
And so I know you just said that they created a soft landing, but tell us a little bit more about that first experience. I mean, presumably, you were learning all the methods sort of, on the job.
Yeah, it was definitely a learn as you go experience. And in hindsight, I'm glad it was. I know a lot of UX folks or people who are in academia who are looking to maybe make this switch into UX are wondering, do I have to take a course? Should I, sign up for a boot camp? And based on my experience as an anthropologist, especially if you're going into qualitative UX research, it really is less about the skill set and developing the skill set so much as learning the language. And for me, the biggest learning curve was less methodological and much more linguistic. So understanding, being able to translate what stakeholders were asking of me into, I guess, anthro speak, so to speak, and then the other way around after, doing my research and doing my analysis and wanting to present it, figuring out how to present my findings in a way that was legible to people like product managers and designers.
I think I saw on LinkedIn, correct me if I'm wrong, but was that a contract role?
Yeah. Yeah. So that was a contract role.
And how do you feel about that? Would you recommend that having had that experience? And I appreciate that it would be different everywhere and there's no one perfect answer here, but I think we're seeing more of those, I would say by and large. You're seeing a lot of kind of foot in the door, kind of, even like 1 year contracts. And so you had a good experience doing that as a way to get in?
Yeah, I think, especially given my personal situation, which was that I hadn't really sought out to go into UX research, it kind of fell into my lap. That was a really low risk, low commitment way of saying, I'll try it out. If it doesn't work, I have no commitment to these folks. And so for me, it worked out really well. And I imagine given the current economic climate, we're seeing lots of layoffs. I think contract roles are not something that's going to be going away anytime soon. And I do think it's a great option for people, to get in there, the foot in the door, as you had mentioned, but also to see if this is really a career that they want to get invested into, because I didn't know anything about what I was getting into, and luckily it worked out for me as a career option. But I also know folks who have gotten into UX research and they're just kind of like, I don't know about this. And interviews, when you're interviewing, especially at, like really big tech companies, it's a very arduous, time intensive process. And so to be able to, I think contracting is another way, again, to get that experience to see if it works for you without having to jump through all of those really intense hurdles of going through, a full-time hiring process.
So you do that, and obviously Microsoft's a pretty good place to get started. Can't go wrong there. But you decide then to move on, and so why did you move to the bank? Or not necessarily why, but like, what was going through your mind at that time? Where were you looking to kind of grow in?
Yeah, well, I think this is the first time that I, made a conscious choice to do something as opposed to things sort of falling in my lap and saying, "Hey, why not?" Um, so I had a great experience at Microsoft, and what had actually happened was, um, and this will vary from company to company, but usually what happens when you're in a contract role is that you can only work as a contractor at that company for a certain period of time because then they start to get into legal fuzziness of you've been here for a really long time. You're doing the same work as a full-time employee. Really, why is this company working with contractors, right? So Microsoft had a certain deadline. You could be a contractor for X amount of time, and then you either had to convert to a full-time role or you had to leave. So I was approaching that point, and what had happened, obviously, happened to all of us, COVID. So I had started in office and then moved to remote when COVID hit. So I was working remotely at the time, and um, lots of personal changes as lots of people experienced during COVID, but I ended up wanting to relocate back to Italy, which is where I am currently. And working at Microsoft. So what I ended up doing was interviewing for a full-time position with a team that was very close to the team that I had worked with as a contractor. And I ended up getting the job offer from Microsoft. But while I was doing that process, I had also applied elsewhere, and I was particularly looking at remote roles. And I also received this offer from Zappo, and Zappo is a fully remote company. They've always been a fully remote company. So COVID didn't, the ways of working didn't get impacted so much for them because they were already working remotely. And what happened was I was kind of presented with these offers. And what really sealed the deal for me was talking to the hiring manager at Microsoft and understanding if there was a possibility to work remotely. And he said, we're trying to be more flexible about it in terms of like working in the US, but because of legal restrictions, tax implications, all of that, we can't hire somebody who's going to be based outside of the US. And so that was essentially the what made the decision for me was I needed to be able to work from where I wanted to work, and the job that I took at Zappo, that was the main deciding factor was they really were allowing me to work from wherever I wanted.
Being a relatively new UXer who kind of goes right into remote, how did that work for you?
Well, I will say I didn't, let's see, I'm trying to think about how much time I had actually spent in the office. So I started in July, and then by March, we were working fully remotely. So that's 8 months in the office. And it was fine. But as especially as an anthropologist, like I was very used to working in a solitary environment. I was very used to having flexibility in my work schedule when I was doing field work. You have interviews and you're doing your observation at all hours of the day. And so the idea of having a fixed schedule was not something that I mean, I'm sure I could have adapted to it, but it was not something that that came easily to me. And so that was the other thing that was wonderful about remote working was not only the commute and not having to be in the office, because that part was not as much of a big deal to me, but the idea that working remotely allows you to really create your own schedule if done right. I should caveat because there are a lot of people for whom remote working ends up being exactly like working in an office. You're just doing it at your house. But done well, I think it gives you that flexibility. And so, I can go to the gym in the middle of the day. I can go to, run errands. And really just it just feels like a much more adult way of working. Like I'm responsible for managing my time and my workload, and my coworkers and my manager trust me to do that. And so there's no reason why I need to be in the same place as all of them.
Yeah, and I think it's a really great point about how the reality is, our research often was working around other schedules. So in a sense, we were already doing that. That's again something that hasn't quite come up yet, or at least framed that way. But well taken. So um, the how about though the aspect of actually conducting the research, not remotely, not in the sense of project management and how you manage your time, but presumably some of the research you would have done for your PhD was in person, and obviously, being remote is less embodied, less contextual. So how have you sort of responded to that, and any creative sort of workarounds that you've come up with?
Yeah, so I kind of thought it in two different ways. The first was that I was already changing context so much by getting into UX research. So, the idea of how different the timelines are, the expectations in terms of outputs, the idea of good enough research, which I'm sure gets thrown around with a lot of folks that you've talked to. So that was already enough of a change for me. So like adding the remote work into it, it was just kind of like part and parcel of working in a completely different environment. Um, and and it does require some creativity, but frankly, one of the things I really like about remote work, and this is kind of my anthropological take on it, is the diversity it allows for in terms of participants and who you're able to speak with. When I was at Microsoft, we had a lab and we invited people to come in, and we had, the two-way mirror. They're sitting on one side and you're sitting there taking notes, watching them, which was great. But it was only the people that were in, the immediate Seattle area who were able to take time out of their day to come. And so that really restricted the demographics that you were able to access. And what I find with remote work is now I'm able to speak with people and conduct research with folks all around the world. And I think while that requires a bit more intentionality in terms of how you are trying to replicate a lot of those intangibles in research, like rapport building and nonverbal responses and that kind of thing, I think the overall outcome is that it's better for the discipline.
Again, now you move on to Hotjar relatively recently, and your title there being senior product researcher. There's obviously this debate that happens online about all these different titles, and are they the same? Are they different? So I appreciate you're newer there, but just for the record, have you seen anything different about it? Is the company approaching it in a different way, or do you just now, would you just say that broadly it's UX?
I think the short answer is broadly it's UX. Part of the naming conventions, uh, part of it is due to just kind of legacy naming. Microsoft calls their researchers design researchers. Why? Because at some point that's what they decided and they've just kind of stuck with it. UX research that shows up, it's good for the algorithm. It's easy for recruiters when they're looking for people and when people are looking for jobs. Um, I would say, I mean, while I think it all kind of falls under that umbrella, one of the things, if we're going to get like very kind of linguistically analytical about titles and roles, one of the things that I like about calling myself a product researcher is that it gives a much more holistic expectation about what my role is. And I think this is one of the challenges that a lot of UX researchers face is that, especially if your role is design researcher, is that you're very closely linked to designers, which is fair. I mean, some of my closest stakeholders are designers and we work very closely together, but that's not that it's kind of limiting to assume that that is the work of the researchers to facilitate design or validate design decisions. When if you are lucky to be in a company that has high enough UX maturity, the role of the UX researcher, the scope of the UX researcher or product researcher, or whatever you want to call it, goes so much further beyond simply working with design. And so one of the things I like about calling myself a product researcher is that I think it points to the fact that research touches all areas of the product, not just simply design.
And before they are users, quote unquote, and right, and really the whole customer journey in some sense. Which there again, there's like this sort of overlap with CX and other such terms that get thrown about, but we don't need to go too deep into that. But yeah, I'm with you. I sort of appreciate the more global perspective. And so, have you already had the opportunity, to kind of get into some of that beyond just the sort of user aspect of the product?
Yeah, and this is actually one of the things that I really love about Hotjar. Despite the fact that I've joined very recently, one of the things that really appealed to me, especially during the interview process when I was considering whether or not it would be the right role for me, is that one, research is a given. The importance and value of research is a given, and that I don't think can really be over stated. That is to say, the value of having a team um, and the value of having an org that just implicitly understands the value of research is extremely rare, from what I've seen. And two, makes your job so much easier and opens up possibilities for you to expand your role in so many ways. Because I hear from so many of my research colleagues in different companies, and this is really across industry, across company size, um, how much effort they have to put in just to get people on board with the idea that research can be valuable, right? And so the fact that that is not something that I have to worry about in my current role already makes my life so much easier. And because of that, research designers, for example, take a very active role in research. So my favorite thing perhaps about this role is that designers are in charge of most of the tactical and evaluative research. So they're the ones who are doing the usability testing. And, that opens up a whole conversation about the democratization of UX research. And I know that that's a really big debate that's going on within folks who are in UX research roles in industry. But that opens up space for me to really focus on strategic research that goes beyond design and really forces us to think about things at a high level and how research can impact business goals and the questions and the problems that people are having at a much higher level in the company.
I think this raises the question, and I appreciate again that this depends on maturity of the organization, but a lot of younger anthropologists are coming in and thinking it's, that it is very much kind of like in the evaluative area. I think many have a sense that there's more of the strategic kind of component out there, but there's no real conception of teaching that today in higher ed, and quite frankly, you don't really see too much on that even on the internet. So where I'm going with all this is, I think anthropologists have much more to contribute beyond the sort of tactical or evaluative type work that UX has largely become in many places. So how might you help others think about how they can get into that role? Like, is there any resources that you've been using to figure out how you can apply your research skills to the more strategic initiatives?
I think that's kind of the question that every researcher has to confront at a certain point in their career, which is, that's not to say that there isn't value in getting experience in running different types of testing and understanding how that works, because there certainly is. And I think to answer your question, what I would tell people who are getting into research, industry research or tech from academia, specifically with an anthropological background, is that we are uniquely positioned as part of our training to be able to see the big picture, zoom way into the micro, and then zoom back out again. And I think that is one of the things that makes anthropological training so well suited to these kinds of business research environments, because we can take in those kind of higher level business strategy questions, see how that would filter down to a very specific product group or even feature, and then zoom back out to see how the reactions or the way the user interacts with a particular feature contributes to this larger business question or strategic initiative. And because that's what anthropologists do, right? Like, that is what we're experts in, is like lots of context, zooming into one person, zooming back out. And I think that's the big value that anthropologists contribute to the research profession and industry. As to resources, I don't know if I have things off the bat around that particular question, but a lot of the resources that I really admire, or the folks who write books that I really admire, are people who are come from sociological or anthropological backgrounds and then have shifted to industry and have spent several years in the industry. So, Erica Hall comes to mind. Sam Ladner is one of my favorites. She writes very short, accessible books on mixed methods research and moving into industry from academia. So there are people out there who are doing this kind of work. And despite the fact that UX has become kind of a buzzword in the last few years, the idea of research or business research in companies is something that goes way, way back. So it's not a new thing. People have been doing this for a while.
So, on the topic of sharing information, you also do some speaking. And so do you think that, where's your stance on, the role that anthropologists have in helping to, increase our visibility as a discipline, but also kind of help to put forward a particular point of view, on UX?
I think this is a couple twofold. The first is from a methodological perspective, how to do good research. And this is one of the things that I like to speak about with teams that either don't have a UX researcher, or the UX researcher is, can only go so far and they have more need for research than there is availability. Which is, if you're going to do research, regardless of the scale, do it right. And obviously, industry has a lot of time constraints and quality constraints in a way that is very different from academia. But I feel very strongly that you can do good good research, even if you're on a time crunch, even if you have a lot of various parameters that you have to adhere to. So that's kind of like one of the hills that I'm willing to die on. And then the second being that, and this ventures into the sort of cliche, which is around diversity. And, the Margaret Mead quote about diversity in anthropology and the beauty of anthropology is like the classic example. But really, when you think about tech, and for a very long time, who is a user has followed a very, very narrow understanding. And because so much of it was in person, like I said, and this points back to kind of like the lab example at Microsoft, is you were getting feedback from a very specific and narrow subset of the population. And I think what anthropologists can really bring to the table is the business value, so we're not just like fluffy, diversity for the sake of diversity, but like actually bring business value by expanding your user base and expanding the diversity of the folks that you're talking to, whether that's talking about, differently abled people for accessibility things, people from different cultural backgrounds. And that's something that anthropologists are very comfortable with, and I think can help others, their coworkers around them, dip their toes into and slowly get used to over time.
Appreciate all that input. And if you had to, is there, considering again that you're yourself relatively early in the journey, anything that you've learned, along the way over the past 3 jobs that you would offer to anybody else to help them get started?
I think one of the things, we talked about contracting. I think your experience as a researcher can differ so much depending on the context that you find yourself in. So I would say that gaining different experiences in different sizes of companies and different industries is directly contributes to what you think of UX as a profession, because I think how people understand their experience as a UX researcher, we might be surprised by how different those experiences are. And this is sort of like I guess we're getting a little meta, where if you're going to evaluate user researchers as the users, right, there are some common pain points that you see across UX research as a profession. And those are the things that we always lament to each other about. But an experience at a gigantic, like working at Google versus working at a small period app startup are going to be wildly different things. And you might think that you hate UX research. You might think, it's maybe not for me, because you haven't found a context in which you can do your best work and in which you feel comfortable. And so I would say, as much as you can, try out different experiences, and contracting is a great way to do that. But also recognize in yourself, like what kinds of contexts or what environments allow you to do your best work. And for me, that decision to not take the role at Microsoft and to instead go to a remote role was very much an internal assessment for me about what circumstances are going to allow me to thrive as a researcher and continue to feel motivated and excited about going to work on a regular basis. And you won't know that about yourself unless you're exposed to different kinds of work experiences.
Very well said. And so, if anybody wanted to get in touch with you to learn more about your work or to kind of hear more of your perspective, where would be a good place for them to reach out?
Yeah, sure. I'm very opinionated. I have lots of opinions. So if you want to hear more of my opinions, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, which is the kind of conventional way, or you can reach out to me via my website, which is sarahefny.com. And I have a contact form there. I feel very strongly about talking to folks who are in academia. That's the other hill I would die on, which is that, academia, anthropology to UX is not necessarily a given. There are other industry, non-academic opportunities that are great for anthropologists, but it's really important to me that folks in academia at least know of UX as a potential option. And so if you have questions about that, if you're not sure whether or not it's right for you, if you just want to know what a day in the life looks like, I'm always happy to chat.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for that. And Sara, thanks for taking the time.
Of course, Matt. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you all for listening to the Anthro to UX podcast. To learn everything you need to break into UX, visit anthro2ux.com. There you will find all the podcast episodes and career coaching resources. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.